everybody. My name is Rania, and my thesis is called At What Cost? Women of Color Therapists and Emotional Labor. So, the main question of my thesis is, how do women of color therapists perform, experience, and negotiate emotional labor in their work and in their life? So the reason why I chose to do this thesis is because, number one, I'm really passionate about therapy. I've been in therapy for a few years and it's been great. I think everyone should do it. I took a class with Professor Pittman last year, and we talked a lot about affective or emotional labor, and I found it really interesting. And then I found myself thinking about how therapy and emotional labor are connected, and also how women of color therapists specifically experience this. And so that is what led me to writing this thesis. So to give a little bit of background, what is emotional labor? Emotional labor is a term that was coined by the American sociologist Arlie Hochschild in 1983 in her book, The Managed Heart. And it is defined as labor that requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. So most of the literature that is on emotional labor stems from her work, and it surrounds workers mainly in the service industry. So like thinking about like the cashier who has to maintain a very specific outward persona to do their job despite what they actually might be feeling, just because that's what they're expected to do. So here's a little comic to kind of like sum up what emotional labor is and what that looks like. So there's this guy, he's at Sandwich World, and he said, "I thought the girl was flirting with me when she made my sandwich, took my money, and called me honey. So imagine my embarrassment when she made a sandwich and took money from the next guy and called him honey too. Sigh, she's such a gold digger." So this is like kind of like showing like sort of like what that looks like in the service industry, and also speaks to the way that emotional labor is a very gendered thing. So some of the existing literature that is on emotional labor, like I said, stems from Hochschild's original theories, and a prevailing theory or prevailing idea is that those who perform emotional labor experience that it seeps from their work into their lives. And that's something that I have found to be true in my results, which I will talk about later, but also is something that I want to interrogate a little bit further because it's more complicated than that. Something else that I was thinking about when looking through the existing literature is the fact that there's very, very little research on connecting emotional labor and race. And I found this especially troubling considering the fact that there are very specific forms of emotional labor that women of color specifically are forced to perform every day, from staying cool, calm, and collected in the face of racist microaggressions, having to take on the responsibility of educating white people about their identity, and so on and so forth. So then I also looked at literature on caring labor specifically, and caring labor encompasses jobs such as therapy, elderly care, caring for the disabled, child care, and things like that. And so care work is a type of emotional labor, but the reason it differs from the types of emotional labor that I discussed before is because it usually involves establishing and maintaining a prolonged, long-term relationship with clients, rather than what ends up being the more transitory nature of jobs in the service industry. And as a result, interactions with clients feel less commodified and can end up being more fulfilling. And then I'm just gonna go a little bit into my methods for this thesis. So what I did was I interviewed 7 women of color therapists who I found through just people that I know, also through the Therapy for Black Girls directory and the Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network directory online. And then once I had all my interviews done, I color-coded them based on these 13 themes that you see here. So some of them would be the orange one is setting boundaries, people's experiences in graduate school and training, or like expectations that come with being a woman of color therapist. So I'm actually going to read one of the quotes from one of my interviewees about boundary setting. So she said, "I can't be a therapist 24/7. Like in my personal relationships, I just can't be the therapist. The professional cap that I put on, which requires certain boundaries, requires certain boundaries. So there's all these expectations in being a woman of color where it's like, oh, you're a woman of color and you're a therapist. You want to hear all of my problems. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Your therapist wants to hear all of your problems. So that area, I think, can get tricky at times in terms of others' expectations of me, and then also taking a step back and reminding myself that I chose to do this as a profession, and this requires certain structural hygiene in order for it to be an effective process, and that can happen in my personal life." So this really speaks so the person who I interviewed, her name is Amanda, and she's really just like highlighting the idea that like therapy is designed to be this like very particular space, and like that's where it's supposed to stay. And she intentionally like creates very strict boundaries because otherwise she can't do her job properly. And that's what she means when she says structural hygiene. So I'm gonna go a little bit into more into my results. So I divided my results into two parts, emotional labor inside of work and then emotional labor outside of work. So in terms of what happens in the therapeutic space itself, I learned that a lot of the therapists I spoke to work through like a relational approach, or what they called an anti-oppressive or intersectional approach. So the relational approach, like what that looks like is the therapist expressing very transparent and authentic emotions with their clients, just like being really real and sort of modeling that and showing their clients that it's okay to like express like how you really feel. And then another thing they do would be like actually like directly implicating themselves into the session and like asking questions like after the client says something, being like, how do you think I feel about what you just said? So like really just like putting themselves into the session, and as a result like making sure it's more of a back and forth, like mutual conversation rather than just like a one-sided thing. And then a lot of the therapists also spoke about the difficulties they had with this kind of approach. Experiences with feeling triggered or feeling upset or like deeply affected by something their client said and how hard that can be, but then also talking about how that improves over time, and that's like a continual process that takes like hard work. And then as for the anti-oppressive or intersectional, or also some called it like a feminist approach to therapy, what that means is that the therapists I spoke to were like very intentional about bringing up matters of identity and power and privilege within the therapeutic space, because they recognize that these are things that will affect the dynamic in the space, and it makes sense to like bring them up. So that was actually really interesting to me because like as I heard more about like this like anti-oppressive approach, I realized like that's an added form of emotional labor that I wasn't like expecting to hear about. Like there's a labor in like talking about matters of power and privilege that is like that happens in addition to like the things that are already like set in place. So in terms of the emotional labor outside of work, therapists spoke about their experiences in training and grad school programs, as well as the general like expectations that are placed on women of color, and then also the importance of boundaries. So some of the like phrases that they used were like, they talked about like friends, family, and acquaintances, making them feel like they're like this like 24/7 caretaker. Or like one of my interviewees talked about how she has to like carry all of these burdens and like hold people's trauma because she has to like fulfill this role of like being the South Asian daughter. And then like one of my other interviewees, Maya, talked about how as a Black woman she has to fulfill this like manly stereotype of like holding everyone else's pain and like having to have this like outward persona of like being totally fine with it and like being happy with that, because that's what she's just expected to do. So yeah, that's some of the things they talked about. And then also like in like training programs in grad school, like having to like, because like a lot of the curriculums were like very, like didn't really like touch on issues affecting like people of color. They had to like do the labor of like talking about like issues regarding like race and identity, and it was like the responsibility was like placed on them. And then finally, the importance of boundaries. So I'm gonna like talk a little bit more about that in my important findings. So I like found that through my interviews, I found that women of color therapists do indeed have to perform large amounts of emotional labor inside and outside of work. However, I found more positive associations with this emotional labor due to the deep and intimate relationships formed with clients. And like a huge reason why this is the case is because the therapists are very intentional about how they set boundaries. A lot of the therapists I spoke to talked about therapy as something that provides rather than takes away structure. And many describe therapy as a sacred space that's designed, as I said before, to do a very particular thing. And it's unfair to both the therapist and the client to try to bring that into personal interactions, because it's just like not going to be the same and is not going to be helpful for either party. And another thing that the therapist I spoke to said is that they think that all therapists should be in therapy themselves, that they need this space outside of the therapy session to process their emotions, because they're feeling things too and they need somewhere to put that and to work through all of that. I'm just going to read a quote by one of the people that I interviewed, Nadia. She said, "I think that being a therapist has helped me set boundaries. What's nice about therapy is that there's a structure. People come to your office, people come on time, they leave on time, they pay you on time. It's just something that's very structured. It actually allows you to see when boundaries are crossed even more, and I think that actually helps me in my daily life." So I think that really like sums that up and also speaks to what Amanda had said earlier about the structural hygiene that is inherent in therapy. So yeah, and so like to like echo that point, a lot of the therapists spoke about how if boundaries are not established and maintained, it's impossible to be a good therapist. The thing about boundaries was really interesting to me because like going into this thesis, like I had like a vague idea, like I figured like it's important for therapists to set boundaries, but it's something that like all of them were like very like serious about, and all of them like made like a point to bring up, and I wasn't expecting that, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I just want to like conclude this thesis by like hopefully, like for me at least, like this thesis has like helped me to rethink the way that I conceptualize the work that women of color therapists do. One of my interviewees was talking about how people in her life are like, yeah, like your job is just like sitting there and listening to people and that's all you do. But that's not it. Like there's a lot more. And really just like recognizing all of the work and energy and like the very particular type of work and energy that goes into this job for women of color therapists, I think is like really important. And then on a larger level, just ascribing more value to care work in general. Care work has historically been devalued for a number of reasons, the main one being that it's typically women's work. But I'm hoping that, with this thesis and with like work along like similar lines, that we can, just see it for what it really is. But yeah, thank you so much.